I suppose what I want to do tonight is two things, really. This is not a night for detailed Aristotelian exegesis, where we're going to get into the text as Aristotelians love to do. It is rather an evening in which I want to tell you something about how it is that a biologist came to write this thing, do this, and secondly, just outline its central argument, which is a very, very simple one. And it's this, that Aristotle, whom all of you know, I mean, all anybody who is educated in Greece certainly knows, and will be acquainted with some of his philosophical works, his metaphysics, his politics, his poetics, and so forth. And all that stuff is really important. I grant you, absolutely. But actually, it's not why he matters, because the truth is, the thing that I want to persuade you of this evening is that he was a scientist. And when I say a scientist, I mean very much a scientist as I and several of my colleagues here are scientists. Really not very different. And indeed, that he was the first scientist. He was the first person to actually engage in this rather intangible activity that we call science. But that can wait for a minute, because what I want to begin with is just telling you how it is that I came to write this. And I hope you won't mind that when I say that it began actually a long time ago, probably when I was 11 years old. So that was when, and I can date it very precisely, it was my 11th birthday when I received a book called My Family and Other Animals by Gerald Durrell. The English people here will know it because many of them will have had to read it at school. It's a much, much loved book. Greeks may not know it necessarily. It doesn't seem to be so popular here, but it describes, and this is the point, a childhood. The young Gerald Durrell in Corfu, circa 1935. He's a naturalist running around collecting animals, insects. He's got this mad family. His elder brother will become the famous writer Lawrence Durrell, and so on. And it is a picture of a childhood that is golden. And I identified with it very strongly because I too was a little boy running around at the time in South Africa where I lived, in the veldt, picking up animals and collecting snakes and shells and all that sort of thing. Except, of course, that it wasn't quite so good for me because my family were rather dull by comparison, especially my siblings, and of course, Jerry didn't have to go to school. I mean, it was just 5 golden free years for him. But it gave me a vision of how life should be led, of what a childhood should be like, which I identified with deeply, 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 and it imprinted it upon me, such that many years later, when I came to Greece for the first time, I was prepared. I was just waiting to be seduced. I mean, really, she just had to look at me, smile, really, and I would have fallen head over heels. It was as simple as that. And of course, Greece, did. And where it happened was a rather unexpected place. It's a bookshop down in Monosteraki. The year is 2001. It is spring. It is the drachma's last spring. It is the first time as an adult that I have been in Greece, and I'm walking around Monosteraki, and I'm tired and I'm crowded, and I see a bookshop, and being a bookish chap, I go in and I begin scanning the shelves, and there I see before me, most of the books in Greek, I can't read them, so I kind of ignore them. But there is a row in Clarendon blue of the collected works of Aristotle translated into English, published by Oxford University Press. Now, here's the thing. I was completely uninterested in them because I knew nothing about Aristotle. Bear in mind, I was trained as a scientist, and scientists don't bother about the past. We are relentlessly forward-looking people. And yet I was a little bit desperate and tired, and I was looking there, and And the owner was there, and he was charming. He was everything that a bookstore owner should be. A man who loved literature. He sat there chain smoking, and he looked like a philosopher. George Papadopoulos, and he's here at the back to my intense pleasure. And he's still there, and the bookshop is still there. It's called Arato. Anyway, so there I was looking at these books, and I saw one of them. One of them caught my eye, and it was a book called Historia Animalium, which is the Latin title for Aristotle's main book, in which he speaks about the natural history of animals. And I took it down. And here is the thing. I opened it up and I started reading. And what I read was this. Let me see if I can find it here. The stomach follows close upon the mouth, and by the way, this organ in the snail resembles a bird's crop. Underneath come two white formations, mastoid or papillary in form, and similar formations are found in the cuttlefish also, only that they are of a firmer consistency in snails than in cuttlefish. After the stomach comes the esophagus, simple and long, and so on, and so on, and so on. And here's the thing. This was poetry to me. I mean, it truly was, because I knew exactly what he was talking about. He was describing the internal anatomy of a snail called the carex, the triton. And in fact, I knew this snail intimately, first of all, because it was one of the very first shells that I had in my shell collection. This is it. You know, when I was a boy, and my parents had picked this up somewhere in their honeymoon in the Mediterranean, and it had sat in the bathroom, and then I had appropriated it for my shell collection. And later on, when I decided to become the world's greatest snail biologist, a thing I never accomplished, but never mind that, I learned the internal anatomy of this thing, and there, in a book, a translation of a book that was more than 2,000 years old, I read and understood exactly what he was going. He spoke to me completely and immediately and directly, and I had no idea that such a thing existed. I mean, I wasn't completely illiterate in terms of history as a biologist, you know. I mean, but for us evolutionary biologists, history pretty much begins with Darwin. But here, this is something entirely new. And I asked some people, you know, I said, if I don't know about this, then surely many other people don't. I mean, this book was just rich with natural history knowledge. And here's another thing. He says, the translator, Darcy Thompson, he says something about Aristotle and where he did this work. And he says, I think it can be shown that in the middle of his life, Aristotle did his biological work not in Athens, but rather on the shores of a calm lagoon called Pyrrha. And he said, this lagoon is found in Lesbos, the island. And again, I was delighted because it just so happened, by coincidence, I had a friend there, Yorgos Kokoros, who's here tonight, one of my oldest friends, and who was at Imperial College at one time. We overlapped. And he had returned back to Mytilene, and I texted him and I said, I'm coming to Lesbos. And he said, come. And I took the ferry that night and I went in search of Aristotle. And that's where this book begins. Because I went to Lesbos, and I discovered that it is a naturalist paradise. It is the perfect place to do biology. Some of you may not know Lesbos, but you will surely at least know that it is not your typical Greek cladic island with some rocks with some little houses on it. It's large, it's verdant, it's in the east, it's close to the Turkish mainland. It's half of it is covered in volcanic stones, but half of it is covered in lush forests with rivers that run down nearly all the year, and there are many species of endemic flowers, and there are birds which migrate from the north every year and then come back in the autumn again. And above all, there is this place, this body of water, the lagoon, the Limnothalassa, and it is It is one of the most rich and wonderful places, biologically speaking, in the Aegean. It is 22 kilometers long, it is 10 kilometers wide, it is 50 meters deep, and it is extraordinarily rich. It is just the place that you could imagine biology would be founded. And if Darcy Thompson, the translator of Historia Animalium, is correct, that is indeed where Aristotle began our science, where he went down to the water, as it were, and picked up a snail for the first time, looked inside, and said, "What's in there?" So how did Aristotle actually get there? I mean, we associate Aristotle with, his school here, the Lyceum, or the academy, which is where he was educated. And the answer is, we're not entirely clear, but roughly the story, at least one story, goes something like this. The year is 347 BC. Aristotle has been at the academy, first as a student of Plato's, then as a teacher at the academy for about 20 years. And Plato dies. And I'm guessing, this is one story, is that he thinks he's the best, the hardest, that he should get the top job. But he doesn't get it. Instead, it goes to his nephew, to Plato's nephew, Speusippus. And perhaps for this reason, Aristotle, in a huff, goes off, leaves the academy, and travels across the Aegean to Assos, which is on the coast of Asia Minor, a small polis, where there was a local tyrant with intellectual leanings who had set up a small mini academy, a branch of the academy, possibly with an attempt to get some philosophers to teach him how to be a better philosopher king. Anyway, Aristotle was among them, and it seems that he spent a few years there, and it seems that he married a woman, a girl, called Pythia. We don't know much about her, except we know that he cared about her because he mentions her in his will many, many years later. She died, and he wanted to be buried with her. We assume she was quite young. He says the best age for a man to marry is 37. The best age for a woman to marry is 18. We know he was 37 when he married Pythia. We're assuming that he was 18. He's a great man for rationalizing everything. The way Darcy Thompson tells it, and he's a bit of a romantic, he says, it was the honeymoon of Aristotle's life. He's left the academy, he's left those arid metaphysical concerns and moral concerns that are the stuff of Plato and his students, and instead he's dealing with biology and the personified in his young bride. And he goes, and we have some biographical material to this effect. He leaves Assos and he goes over to Mytilene. You can see Mytilene, you can see Lesbos from Assos just across the shore. I mean, you can swim across, and this is indeed where many immigrants have recently been doing exactly that. And he spends about 2 years in Lesbos. And somewhere around here, then, is when he does his biology, or at least begins it. So what does he exactly do when trying to construct his biology? Well, the first thing that he has to do is he has to get the facts. He has to begin to accumulate what is known about this body of phenomena that nobody has ever assembled facts about before. Yes, there were the Hippocratic physicians, but they're concerned with the human body. Then there's some lore, sort of occult lore from soothsayers and people like that. But as far as we can tell, Aristotle is the first person who actually turns his attention directly to the living world. And he begins to accumulate data, and this is essentially what Historia Animalium, his great book, central book, is. It is, as it were, a data file. It is a place where he accumulates and orders all the material about the natural world that he will need to build his explanations later for how it all works. So where does he get all this information from? Well, a lot of it comes from hearsay, from talking to people. He spends a lot of time talking to fishermen and hunters and so on. It's absolutely clear. He even refers to them directly in the text. He says, fishermen say this, fishermen say that. Sometimes he's skeptical, sometimes he's a little bit too gullible. He's analyzing and collating all these sources simultaneously. And he also does a great deal of direct personal empirical investigation. This must be the case because if there are some of his dissections in particular which are so detailed that they cannot come from indirect sources. So, for example, sorry, I'll come to that in a sec. So he gives all sorts of natural history lore. This is a fish which he says it makes noise. It's Zeus Faber, and so it does. So he does these dissections. And one of the masterpiece dissections that he does is the cuttlefish. If you go to Colony in the spring, you can see the cuttlefish copulating by the thousands, and the fishermen catch them there exactly as Aristotle describes, because they put out these bundles of wood upon which the cuttlefish come down and they lay their eggs. They're desperate for something solid to lay their eggs on, and then the fishermen put the traps around them, and the cuttlefish go in and they haul them out. And if you take those cuttlefish and you then dissect one, you can do it following Aristotle's instructions, and you can see all the organs that he describes. He doesn't get everything right, it's important to emphasize. So he makes some mistakes which come out of his own theory of biology. So for instance, there's this large structure, reddish structure in the middle over there. He says that's the heart of the cuttlefish. It isn't. It's the liver, but it's central. It's roughly where our heart would be by his understanding of the geometry of the thing. In fact, the cuttlefish has 3 hearts, and they're sort of towards the tail, and they're very small. I mean, and he misses them completely. But he gets plenty of things right. He notices, for instance, that it's got a brain. He works out the peculiar digestive system, the way it loops around and kind of defecates on its head, and he looks at the gills and all these things he describes. And here's the fascinating thing. I mean, and this is just what also gives it that ring of modernity. If you read the description in HA, he says, and if you look at the attached diagram, the part labeled alpha is this, the part labeled beta is this, the part labeled gamma is that. And you say, well, what diagram? So it turns out that there was a whole book of anatomical diagrams, or maybe it was intercalated with his original text, it's a little bit unclear, but there were many diagrams, anatomical diagrams, which of exactly the sort that a modern zoologist would use. But they're gone. The monks evidently didn't copy them. Anyway, I thought this was a pity, because Aristotle describes this in such detail, so I thought, well, why don't we try to reconstruct what they would look like? And that's exactly what we did. And I asked a friend, a brilliant naturalist and artist, David Koutsakianopoulos, who's here tonight, and this is a wonderful photo of him. It's exactly what he would like, because he's out of focus, where the plant is the thing that really matters, and he's a wonderful artist and naturalist, and together, but primarily through his genius, we reconstructed some of these Aristotelian pictures, the things that have been lost. Are they accurate? Well, who knows? But it gives us a sense of what is missing from the corpus. He tells all sorts of wonderful things in his story, Animalium, things which many people were very skeptical about for a long time. He says in Macedonia, and remember this is where he comes from, it's his childhood area, there's a fish, a catfish, which has the peculiar property of a peculiar way of breeding. He says, in most species, it's the female that looks after the babies, but not with this catfish. In this catfish, it's the male that looks after them. The female lays the eggs, and completely feckless, she just disappears, and it's the males that raise the babies. Cuvier, other 18th, 17th, 18th, even through 19th century zoologists read this in Aristotle. They were continually mining Aristotle for bits and pieces. They read this and dismissed this as a story. It wasn't until the early 1800s that Agassiz at Harvard, who himself came from Switzerland and actually knew of something, sort of a related fish, said, there is such a fish. And he described it as Silurus aristotelis, and it is a fish that has exactly this habit. And it still lives in Upper Macedonia, and it's rather rare. And it's just as Aristotle describes. Some of his information, I gotta say, however, is a little bit rockier. So he doesn't just confine his descriptions to animals about Greece, to Greek animals. He actually ranges all over the known world. So, for example, he has a lot to say about elephants. And there's a question as to how he knew about elephants. Pliny has a story in which he has Alexander, Aristotle's student, collecting animals all throughout the East and sending them back to his old tutor in Homage. That's almost certainly nonsense. Pliny is a famous liar, and there's actually no evidence that Aristotle really saw an elephant, although he has a lot to say about them, and including some surprisingly inaccurate things. So, for instance, he thinks that elephants are semi-aquatic. They're sort of like hippos, and indeed, that he gives a very elaborate explanation for him, this is why they have trunks. The reason that elephants have trunks is because they're so clumsy when they live in a semi-aquatic environment, and they're therefore at risk of drowning. So in order not to drown, the elephant has a trunk which it uses as a kind of a snorkel. And it would be wrong to say that elephants are semi-aquatic. They're certainly not hippos. On the other hand, they do indeed use their trunks as snorkels, and they do occasionally swim. And this is one which it doesn't happen to be using its trunk as a snorkel, but it's swimming off Sri Lanka, and they can actually do so for substantial periods of time. So that just gives you sort of a flavor of some of the things that Aristotle speaks about in his natural history. But what is it that exactly makes him so special? It's not just the accumulation of facts. And it's not just that there are theories about the world. To see what makes him so special, you really have to put him in the context of the academy, of his teacher, Plato. Plato is this intellectual giant. And Aristotle's whole view, however, his whole vision, in my view, is to take Plato's system and worldview and turn it upside down. Late in his life, Plato writes a work which appears to be of natural philosophy, the Timaeus. I think some people will say that it's a kind of science. I don't think it is at all. It's really just a fantasy of how Plato thinks the universe is constructed. It's based upon no evidence whatsoever and pure a priori mathematical and philosophical reasoning. But that's, of course, very typical of Plato, because Plato isn't fundamentally interested in this world. Plato is fundamentally interested in the world beyond the senses, and the world that we actually see is merely a shadow world. Aristotle says no, that's not the way it is. Plato's ideas make nonsense of nature. The thing that really matters is the world that we perceive directly with our senses. It's this world we can see and smell and taste. And that is the fundamental break, the thing that you have to accept when you start to become a scientist. There's a passage that gives you a sense of this immediacy, the way in which Aristotle approaches the world. And the way I imagine it is that he's at the Lyceum later in life, and he's teaching a bunch of students his biology. He's running a great course in natural science, and he wants them to do some dissections. He wants them to do some cuttlefish dissections, and these gilded Athenian youths are looking at this and saying, "Ick." At these mouldering cuttlefish beginning to go rather high on the marble slabs. And Aristotle, getting a little bit impatient, says, he says this. He says, "We should not, like children, react with disgust to the investigation of the less elevated animals. There is something awesome in all natural things. Some strangers, so the story goes, wanted to meet Heraclitus. They approached him, but saw he was warming himself by the stove. 'Don't worry,' he said. 'Come on in. There are gods here too.' In the same way, one should approach research on animals of any type without hesitation, for inherent in each of them there is something natural and beautiful. Nothing is accidental in the works of nature. Everything is absolutely for the sake of something else. The purpose for which each has come together or come into being deserves its place among what is beautiful." Scholars call this the invitation to biology. And to me, it is just a clarion call. It is the first time that somebody says, whatever, all these squishy things that we mostly despise, they are beautiful and worthy of study. So I've just told you a little bit about Aristotle's natural history. But the truth is, the thing that makes him so remarkable is that this natural history is just the beginning, because he didn't write just one book about biology, he wrote more than half a dozen, and they in fact collectively comprise about 1/3 of his surviving works. I would say that if you were to characterize Aristotle in any way, you would say he is fundamentally, just in terms of pages, a scientist. Each of these books tackles one part of the biological world, one way of understanding living things, such that collectively they form actually a system of awesome completeness, a system that hasn't been achieved by any one man since. So take, for instance, the parts of animals. This is where you see his teleology at work. Aristotle is a purpose man. He wants to explain things in terms of purposes. And so he looks at the birds, and he has many passages about all the different kinds of birds, and he discusses their parts, why they have beaks so this way, and why certain beaks are associated with certain kinds of legs and wings, and so on and so forth. And he explains these all in functional terms, why seed eaters have short beaks and short legs, why raptors have curved beaks and talons and so forth. This is pure adaptationist biology. It is almost Darwinian in flavor, except of course Aristotle is, and I won't go into this, he is no evolutionist. He doesn't know anything about natural selection. In fact, he emphatically rejects this, but nevertheless, he is an adaptationist in the sense that he perceives and explains the parts of animals in terms of their fit to their environment. And it's something which the whole book is about. But it's more than that. It runs very deep. There's a book which is sometimes not thought to be about his biology, but actually it is the core of his biology. It's a book called De Anima, or The Soul. Aristotle's term is psyche. So for the Greeks, before Aristotle, were a very traditional vision of the soul, as you read, as I think possibly in Homer, but certainly in the pre-Socratics, is that the soul is as it were chained to the body, and upon death it is liberated, it flies free beyond the body to some other life or form of existence, which is indeed why the ancient word for butterfly is psyche, soul. And I think this is Aristotle explains this. He says this is an allusion to the way in which a butterfly emerges from its chrysalis, from its pupa, and breaks free and flies away. Aristotle thinks this is nonsense. He just thinks this is all complete. This just has nothing to do with the way things are. He says, he's very clear. The soul is not a uniquely human thing. All living things have a soul. In fact, they have, depending on how sophisticated they are, they have 3 souls. There's a vegetative soul, an animal soul, a sentient soul. We're the only ones with sentient souls. There's And it's actually quite hard to pin down exactly what he's getting at, but he's very clear that when an animal dies, the soul dies with it. It's not a vehicle for immortality. It's not something super added. So there's an experiment that he does in which he tries to figure out where the soul exactly is. He says, in some animals, the soul appears to be more distributed than others. It's not centralized. And we know this because if you take a tortoise and you open up its plastron, take out its heart, and glue its shell back on, and then put it down on its forelegs, it'll still walk away. So I saw this tortoise walking around a Quran because I didn't try to repeat the experiment. I think it might work for a little bit. Aristotle's point is that the soul is a system, but it's more distributed in tortoises in some ways. But where he's really detailed about it is in humans. So in several books, he discusses the way in which humans regulate their temperature. So at the core of his physiology is the idea that we are fueled by an internal flame, or a concoction, some sort of heating process, which is based upon the nutrients that we take in, which then goes to the gut and then gets distributed around the body by the vessels, and then goes to the heart, where there's a sort of a boiling mixture, and it gets processed and it gets converted into blood. But Aristotle worries that this internal fire might go extinct like real fires. And so he has a system which he explains in great detail. He says, well, what happens is that this fire gets checked by cooling air, which comes from the lungs, and then that air gets heated again, and then it gets expelled, and so the cycle goes on, and you have a kind of a thermoregulatory system in which you maintain this homeostasis such that the fire keeps going until eventually the whole system gets sort of crudded up, and that's when you die, essentially. So he describes all this in great detail. And the whole system, and this is another one of David's diagrams, which sort of shows the different parts of the components of how it all works. Aristotle describes this in detail, and in sufficient detail that you can ask, actually, does it actually work as he says it does? So the chemistry is wrong, the physics is wrong, the anatomy is wrong. But the question is, if you actually take his anatomy and physics and chemistry for granted, if you assume it, does the system work in the way that he says it does? Well, anyway, you could do various things. You could build a physical model with pipes and bellows and so on and so forth. I didn't. Instead, I did it the modern way. I went down to a colleague at Imperial College in the Department of Electrical Engineering, and I gave him this text, and I said to him, this is what Aristotle says. If we map this out as a control diagram, will it actually do what Aristotle says it does? And so this is his text. This is a modern control diagram. It's not the sort of thing that Aristotle could have made. It's couched in terms of differential equations, but it contains all the things: the heart going in, the nutrient going in, the heart temperature, the nutrient flows, etc., etc., etc. And you can then look at this diagram, which is isomorphic with Aristotle's text, and you can ask, does it actually work? And the answer is, kind of. So Aristotle, he thinks he's designed, or he thinks he's perceived or has explained an oscillator, a system that's going to pump stuff in and out and explain how our lungs keep breathing and how our heart keeps beating. But it's actually clear if you map out the system that he hasn't described an oscillator. What he's described is a system that will come to a perfect equilibrium. What he's really described is a thermostat. But that's kind of remarkable in itself, because what is described is a system with the core of a system. That is to say, it has a feedback loop. It is a homeostatic device. And indeed, it is thought that the Greeks didn't invent homeostatic devices, clocks, until several centuries later, but Aristotle gives a pretty good description of such a device. So the question is, what is the soul? And the answer is, this is the soul. What the soul is for Aristotle, it is the interrelationship between the parts that keeps the thing alive. It is not any one organ. He thinks the heart has a very special place in this system, but it is fundamentally those interrelations of parts. And that is what he is trying to describe in the De Anima. And I should say, although no other scholar has dared to do anything quite as mad as make a control diagram, I mean, it's only a scientist would do this, other classical scholars have been happy to speak of have perceived much the same idea and speak of Aristotle's cybernetic model of the soul. The reason I love this is because, and I concede that every generation reads Aristotle through the lens of its own eyes. The 19th century, which was the great age of classification, they read Aristotle as a classifier. In the 20th century, it's the great age in which we took all animals to pieces and we looked at their organs and we looked at the cells and the DNA and we figured out all those mechanisms, all those little bits and pieces. We essentially brought creatures down, and Aristotle can be viewed in that way as well. But to me, the thing that makes him so striking, so immediate, so wonderful, so modern, strikingly, is the theory of the soul, the system of the soul. Because in the 21st century, what we biologists are doing is taking all the bits and pieces that we've discovered in the 20th and we're putting them back together again to ask how it is that they actually work together. And that requires very complicated control diagrams of this sort, which you see over here. This diagram represents the gene sequence, the gene circuitry that is responsible for making the first few cells in a sea urchin embryo. And it just builds on vastly more complex from that. But that is essentially what Aristotle was after. And I say that because his greatest book, without a doubt, is not the Parts of Animals or the Historia Animalium, the book that introduced me to him. It's The Generation of Animals. And it's his biggest one too. And it's a beautiful book in which he explains how animals come to be, in his words, where they come from the egg and in the womb. And this is where you have some of his empirical triumphs. As far as we know, and possibly accepted for a Hippocratic, which we have rumor of in the text. He's the first person to open up a chick egg and watch it develop from just a smidgen into an animal which lies there beating with its little heart on the albumen. And he describes this in detail in a way that any biologist would recognize. And more than that, Aristotle doesn't just describe, and this is his vision of development, how the soul comes to be, how form of an animal comes to be. He wants to know how it's transmitted from one generation to the next, because this is the mystery of mysteries. We can accept that an animal can grow into some form, but how is it that a man produces a man and a horse produces a horse? That is the great difficulty, the difficulty of inheritance, how forms are transmitted. And Aristotle has a crack at this over the course of a good chapter in book 4 of The Generation of Animals. And I won't go into the details of his system because it is fundamentally wrong. It involves heat from the male fluids acting upon the female fluids, and then there's a balance of them and so on. I'll just give you a sense of it though. So he doesn't have much data about inheritance. So he's sort of looking around and just trying to make sense of the basic facts. Sometimes children look like their mothers, sometimes they often look like their fathers, boys look one way, look the other way. Sometimes you can have people who look like their grandparents. I mean, how do you put all this stuff together? And he chooses to talk about this in terms of noses, just to give you an example, just as an example. So everybody knows that Greeks have long, strong, noble, straight noses. And Aristotle seems to think that's kind of the default way you build a nose. So there's There is, however, one famous character who doesn't have a nose that is your classic Greek nose, and that's Socrates, who has a snub nose. And so he decides to have quite a lot of fun with Socrates' nose, and he devotes pages to analyzing how it is that Socrates might have got his nose, and how his son might have got his nose too, and so on and so on and so on. And I think it's just a little bit of Aristotelian humor. I won't go into the details of the story, but I just do want to point some things out. Darwin had a theory of inheritance, which was wrong. It was called pangenesis. Aristotle, some of the pre-Socratic predecessors, some of Aristotle's pre-Socratic predecessors, probably Democritus, he too had a theory of inheritance, evidently, and it's identical to Darwin's. So much so that scholars will speak of it as the pangenic theory of inheritance. They're applying the new word to the old one. Aristotle demolishes this theory, and he demolishes it for all the right reasons, for all the reasons that Darwin's theory was wrong. And indeed, I would argue, I can't do it here in detail, that prior to the day in which Gregor Mendel crossed some P's in Brno, Czechoslovakia, and began to elucidate the quantitative laws of inheritance, Aristotle's theory was the best theory of inheritance out there. And it was better than Darwin's. So what is this all about? I focused on the biology, but actually the great project of many Aristotle scholars over the last 20, 30 years has been to unify the biology, or to revive the biology, and to show that it's not just a random bunch of biological ideas, but that in fact it runs deep into the bedrock of his metaphysics. And that's always the way it is with Aristotle. And that's the difficulty of dealing with him. You begin with some snails or Socrates' nose, and before you know it, you're just deep into the metaphysics. Aristotle thinks he needs to give an explanation for all this. Why is it that creatures have purpose? Why is it that they have adaptations? And the answer that he gives is weird and wonderful. He says it's and true in some way, at some level, though not ultimately. He says it's in order so that they can perpetuate their forms. That is what they are designed to do. Of course, that just raises the question, why do creatures want to perpetuate their forms? And the answer is, he says, they desire immortality. But why do they desire immortality? And he says, all living things desire to be divine. They are imitating the divinities. Who are these divinities? Well, this is where it all really gets mad, and we start leaving Aristotle the biologist, and we start moving into Aristotle the theologist, the theologian, I should say. Because for Aristotle, the ultimate deities are not the classical ones, the ones of classical Greek myth. He's a little bit contemptuous of those. He thinks it's good for the mob, but really it's just not. It doesn't tell us much about what's ultimately happening. For him, the ultimate deities are living things, immortal living things. They are the stars, or possibly the crystalline spheres circling around in their perfection around the earth. And they're alive, and they're evidently having a good time up there, as far as Aristotle can tell us. And he says, these are the divine things which are kept in motion by the prime mover, sort of some entity that is even further out there, who does nothing but think. And all creatures desire to be like them, but they cannot, because they are earthbound. Being earthbound, they must die. And so, given that they must die, they can only achieve immortality through one way, which is by reproducing their forms in the next generation. It is this system, this part, which is the most difficult for us to understand. I think it must have been quite difficult for his contemporaries as well. And it, of course, fills the part that Darwin's theory of natural selection now fills, which is to explain why creatures reproduce and therefore why they have the forms and the adaptations that they do. And all that stuff follows from them, which is a straightforward materialistic explanation, which appeals to neither to a creator nor to any deity which we're imitating. And it should be said, Aristotle's not a creationist. He's much stranger. He's an eternalist. He just thinks this whole system keeps ticking along. Where does he get it from? I drew a contrast between Aristotle and Plato. And it's true that I find Aristotle as sympathetic as I find Plato unsympathetic, to say the least. But at the same time, you cannot but acknowledge how the work of his teacher, how his own writing is infused with the thoughts of his teacher in so many different ways, albeit always transmuted. And this notion of immortality and desire, of course, you can see it in the Symposium, albeit in a completely different note, where Diotima speaks about and asks, why is it that we love beauty? And the answer is we love beauty because we wish to reproduce beauty. And all men desire to reproduce what is beautiful, either in physical form or, as Plato quickly, of course, intellectualizes things, or for the sake of ideas. But it is from that immortality, that is what we seek when we seek and love beauty. It is the desire and the pursuit of the whole. That idea, we find it in Plato and we find it in Aristotle too, buried there beneath the biology. I could go on for ages about Aristotle's, the wonderful things that Aristotle tells us about living things, and I could criticize him and praise him, and I could say, he got this right, got that wrong. I mean, there's a book, right? But I want to just tell you one more thing, which is why there's a passage which speaks to me so strongly as a scientist, which I love so much. And it's about honeybees. So here's the thing about honeybees. It's in the generation of animals. Most kinds of animals come in two forms, male, female, right? Honeybees are a problem. They come in three forms, the forms that today we now know as workers, drones, and queens. Aristotle doesn't know workers are female, sterile females, queens are females, and drones are males. He doesn't know that. He's trying to figure it out. So he sits down and he analyzes the situation logically. How is it that three separate entities can reproduce themselves generation after generation after generation, as they evidently do, because beekeepers find them regularly, all three of them, regularly in honeycombs. And he gets a whole bunch of information from beekeepers, all the information he can, and he works through this data, some of which is reliable, some of which is not, and he sort of sifts it, and then in an axiomatic fashion he works through it, in a syllogistic fashion, actually. He works through the possibilities, all possible combinations of, X, mates with Y, mates with Z, and da-da-da-da-da. And he comes to a conclusion at the end, and he says, I think this is the way it is. And it's not the way it is, because it turns out that bees have a haplodiploid reproductive system, which is a complicated kind of genetics, which, of course, he doesn't know anything about. But this is what he says, and this. So here's the thing, Aristotle is usually quite Olympian. When he's considering other theories, he kind of knocks down other people's theories. Plato says this, he's an idiot. Democritus says that, he's an idiot. This is the way it is, right? But here, for once, he's not quite as confident. He says, at the end of the bees, he says, so this, at least, as far as theory goes, seems to be the situation about the generation of bees. In conjunction, that is, with what people believe to be the facts about their behavior. Not that there is currently any proper understanding of what those facts are. But if, in the future, they are understood, it will be when the evidence of the senses is relied on more than theories, though theories have a part to play, so long as what they indicate agrees with what is seen. And do you know something? As a scientist, when I read that, my heart just leaps. I say, yes, yes, yes. This is the essence of science, right? I mean, set aside any philosophical theories, any notions about the hypothetical deductive method or the importance of mathematics or the need for experimentation. All that stuff really just doesn't matter. What the core of it is that the evidence of senses should agree with our theories, and that when the evidence of our senses changes, we should change our theories. That is the essence of science, and that is why he speaks to me so directly across so many generations. Aristotle says in the Metaphysics, it's the first line, he says, all men desire to know. It's a beautiful line. I think he's wrong. I think most people don't desire to know. But he gives us credit for it, at least. I mean, it tells us why we think, what we should be like, right? And he says, somewhere in the Nicomachean Ethics, he says, he's considering the different ways to spend a life. And he's talking about generals and politicians and people like that, and he says, it's all very fine to be that. It's all very honorable. And he says, but the best way to spend a life is to spend it searching for the causes of things. And that is what he did and what his children, we scientists, have done ever since. Well, I've given you, I hope, some sense of what this book is about and why I love him so much, and why I wrote it, and why I guess partly why I was so pleased so delighted when it was going to be translated into Greek, because it is such a wonderful story that and I think even people, even Greeks who know so much about Aristotle, your man in the street knows about Aristotle, don't know this story. But I knew, it wouldn't be an easy book to do, and so we pitched it to a bunch of Athenian publishers sometime after it came out. My agents did their thing, and they kind of muttered and they said, well, it's awfully thick and it's kind of technical, and Aristotle's all very nice and so on and so forth. And, it's nice that it's won a prize. It won a prize, and Michael Moskos from the London Hellenic is here. And I'm deeply grateful for his support. But, the crisis and all that, really. But then I got an email from a young guy called Panos Charitos. And he said, dear Professor, I'm a physicist, a scientist like you. Puts that right up front. From CERN in Geneva, and he says, but really, I've actually got a new publishing house which we're starting. We've done a few books, and it's called Ropi, and it's devoted to popular science books, translating them, and we'd love to do your book. We're based out of Thessaloniki, and I knew right away, not just because Panos was a scientist. He's not here tonight. He's in Geneva attending the cyclotron, I imagine, the LHC. By himself, and I knew right away that this is the guy that I should do it with, right? I mean, we're in the depths of, the Greeks are in the depths of their crisis. It's all going to pot, and here's a guy who's going to start a new publishing company out of Thessaloniki. Really, obviously, this should be my guy, right? And he said, well, but it's going to be a bit of a problem, to translate this thing. So I said, yeah. And he said, well, okay, we'll get not one, but we'll get two translators. Takes a team, and here they are tonight, Alex and Emily Kritikou, and they are responsible for the book plus the extra bit. Somewhere in there. And they labored long and hard on this book. And it was clear that despite their expertise, because they are both scholars in their own right with their own specialties, we needed to get a small team of people behind them to help them. And so I asked Stavrounias, who's a brilliant young Aristotelian scholar from Patras, whom I met at a conference, and whether he would help with the sort of the more technical Aristotle sides to make sure the specialists don't get all upset. And then I asked Yorgos Kokros and David to help us with the biological side and getting the names and the animals right. And so we had the small team of people. And together they've worked and they've put together the book beautifully. And then we needed a cover. And Panos suggested some. I thought they were not very nice. So I said, I know a young designer here in Athens, Niki Thimopoulou, and I think she might, if we ask her, do something. And she did, and I think it's a gorgeous cover. Anyway, really what tonight is about is thanking those people, but actually it's more than that, because, I said, that I said that I was ready to be seduced by Greece. And the question is, what exactly is it that, well, there are so many things, of course, right, that are so seductive. But one of them, and I think it was Larry Durrell who said this, I'm not sure, maybe in his book about Corfu, Lawrence, he said, what Greece gives you is the gift of friendship. And so these people who have become very, very dear to me, and it is for that I'm so grateful to them. And I suppose that's really the thing that I actually wanted to say about this book, is that, the truth is, it's not, the reason that I'm so delighted that it is translated into Greek is not really because I think the Greeks need to know about Aristotle the scientist. Actually, they really don't. The truth of the matter is that Greece has given me so much of all these years, and this is the only thing, however small it is, that I can give back to her, and for that I'm grateful. Thank you.